This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 11:07 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast. You're on Ask a Rabbi.
And this is this is Rabbi Shafir Loeb for Congregation Eitz Chayam, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast. And welcome everyone. I'm sitting here half asleep. Don't mind me.
You've probably been cooking all
I
week.
have been cooking. I have made haroset. I have made chopped liver. And last night we made the
Chopped liver.
horseradish. Chopped liver is delicious. You have to taste it. Don't think about it. Taste it.
I don't think. Now, horseradish I love. It's good stuff.
So I'll start out with a funny story about my mother. My mother, the rabbi's wife. And it was traditional at our house to always have a huge crowd usually we had one Seder at home and one Seder for the community in the synagogue. And
How large?
the one at home was often like 20 to 30 people. The table was extended considerably.
The couple that Carol and I have attended in the San Fernando Valley were, I think, larger than that.
Could be.
Maybe 30, 35 people.
Yeah.
It was huge.
Yeah, this one particular year, which in some ways was not unlike this year, and I'll tell that story too, but she only had white horseradish. She had forgotten to get the red. And the red, of course, is milder horseradish.
I've never even heard of that. I've only seen the white.
It comes in white and red, and now with thanks to wasabi, it comes in green.
Wasabi.
Wasabi.
I love wasabi. Oh.
So anyway, back to the horseradish. So she had forgotten to get red horseradish, and a lot of people like the red because it's milder. It's cut with beets. But she didn't have beets, and she colored it red with food coloring. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you're expecting the milder horseradish and you take the great big spoonful of it on your fish, people were ready to say words to her.
Surprise, surprise.
Mm-hmm. So, anyway, this year I did my best to acquire red horseradish and white horseradish and wasabi radish because they're a big part of the meal. And instead of having 4 bottles of red and 2 bottles of white, we ended up with 6 bottles of white because they were out of the red in the market. Unfortunately, I guess there was a run on it. And so last night I made the beets and mixed in the beets and made the correct red horseradish. So.
Huh, okay. So
yeah, you cook beets and grind them, and it cuts the sharpness.
Yeah, that would
right.
do it.
Now, it's worth noting that horseradish, of course, it's supposed to be bitter herbs. That's what horseradish has come to represent in the Seder. And it's really not bitter. It's sharp. It's a different taste. And so at our Seder, we do have a little more of a bitter herb, which is romaine lettuce. Romaine lettuce, in fact, is a really good one for Passover because when you start chewing on it, it's sweet. But as you chew on it, it becomes bitter.
Huh, okay.
Yeah. So it's and that is seen as what happened with the time in Egypt. In the beginning, it was good. And then the people got suckered into slavery, some say, but certainly became, and it's a different kind. It's not the African American slavery that we saw, the African slaves in the Americas and in Europe, for that matter, that started in the 1400s and certainly was there at the beginning of the forming of America. It's a different kind of slavery. It's much more like undocumented workers.
Oh,
which also
Okay.
is a kind of slavery. And
Well,
we
sure, obviously.
really don't recognize how important that economic segment is to the American economy. So I like to remind people we are the capital in Hunger Games. We really are. And it was a very chilling commentary to me when I first saw that movie.
See, we've never seen that.
You've got to see that one. I saw it on a plane, but I spent a lot of time commuting back when that movie came out.
Huh. Well, I think Carol and I'll dig that one out.
Yeah, it's worth digging out Hunger Games. It's couched in some other things, but it is a comment on what happens when you're living in a certain environment.
Yeah. Well, you look at the salad bowl of America, which is basically cultivated by the farm workers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
you look at the garment workers in New York.
Not even in New York. I mean, well, now not in New York. Now in China and Bangladesh and other places where human rights inspections are few and far between, if ever, and not even considered. There's a wonderful website out there that is something like how many slaves work for you, or how many slaves, yeah. And you can find out what your footprint is based on the records of the different countries from which we get our goods.
Ooh.
Yeah, very sobering.
Yeah, that sounds like it.
Because we live in a first world country, and not that there aren't slaves in America, there are still far too many. Far too many. And that's a serious topic for many discussions. And this is Pesach, Passover, which for Jews is really all about freedom and about the ability to come home when you want to. And it's a very different holiday than it is for other religions that have a connection into it. So let's do some trivia on Passover. Things that people might not know and might not recognize. As I said, it's the holiday of freedom. And interestingly, in order to achieve that freedom, you have to get rid of the chametz, which is usually translated as leavening or yeast, but that's really not a good translation. A better translation would be the puffiness. And there's a couple of different explanations for it, and Scriptures has a different one. But the rule is there should be no leavening, no puffiness, none of that visible within your boundaries, whatever the heck that means. One of the explanations for it is that we left Egypt in a hurry that night, and there wasn't time to let the wheat sit out overnight and leaven. And as I've explained in previous shows, if we really did bring in the winter wheat harvest and we'd cleaned out everything that was in the storerooms and had a festive meal, there wouldn't have been time to let the wheat rise. But the other explanation that's in Scriptures says that the kneading bowls, the things you would leave out to let the dough rise, were already packed and ready to go. And so they didn't have a way to set it out and let it rise overnight because they didn't have Fleischmann's yeast. There was no Publix, there was no Winn-Dixie, there was no Bravo, no A&P, no Acme or whatever your local supermarket, not even a Sprouts.
Which opens today.
It opens today, right, in St. Lucie West. Looking forward to that. Don't think they'll have too much for Passover, and I won't have time to stop anyway, so we'll look at that later on. Such are the joys. I'm going to be a little busy after this radio show and tonight. I can't imagine why. We are.
Now, you're not doing all this yourself.
No. I do have some helpers in the congregation, but I've done most of the cooking.
The lion's share of the work.
Well, we don't have in our little congregation, we do not have a kitchen per se. And so the cooking doesn't happen at the temple. If it were, then we could have a group in and do it and be done with it. But we don't. And so the easiest way to make sure that the ritual things are done ritually is, unfortunately, to just do it.
And that makes sense. Yeah.
It
I
just
get
does.
Yeah.
And so there are things that others are doing. People are bringing in desserts because that you can buy in the store. And this to me is one of the funniest things. I shop at Publix because it's the supermarket near me, and I'm very happy most of the time with what they do. So yesterday in the market for Passover, they had challah out, which, is like, no, it's matzah, folks. And they did not have many assortments of matzah. They had very minimal choices in matzah, much fewer than I've ever seen there before.
I think you said that a couple weeks ago.
I did, because I've been looking for it. In fact,
Yeah.
I ended up doing the Amazon thing.
Yeah.
And,
no,
ordering it.
No, come on.
I'm serious. I couldn't find it. I went to like 7 different stores, not just Publix. I went to a variety of different stores and couldn't find it. Now, maybe somebody wants to call in at 772-340-1590. I'm going to get this right one of these years. It's written up there right in front of my face. 772-340-1590. It's not easy to read from over here because it's just in ink. But that's another story. Anyway, so I've been looking for different kinds of matzah because I like to show a variety of matzah, but there just has not been the diversity. And I'm guessing that part of that's a COVID response. Right? We're not as filled with people as we were most years, as we were the years before COVID. I guess that's the right way to say it. And of course, 2 years ago we had a complete online. Last year we had online with a couple of people that were in our bubble. And then this year we're reopening it and asking that people be vaccinated and boosted to be in the room with us. But God willing, the numbers will continue to come down for COVID and we'll be able to interact much more normally. So hopefully by next year, Passover will be its
By
usual
the way, did you
big
guys
thing.
get your booster?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
We did too. We just walked into Walgreens. We filled out a little thing on the web, and the next day, just walk in.
We did that at Walmart and just walked in and did it. So I highly recommend it. Felt exhausted after it, a day or so after it. We did it, I think, on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and that Friday I was just zonked. People actually offered to drive me home from services. Got through services, but I was whooped. And fortunately now I'm not quite so tired, although there's been a lot going on. And, so COVID, I think, has had a big impact on it. We are going to be offering a Zoom connection for those who want to Zoom. Some people have purchased the Haggadah for their use at home because we use a special congregational Haggadah. And Haggadah stands for telling. And here's an interesting piece. So I said I was going to do trivia today. A lot of people say, well, we read the Haggadah from front to end. And I'm like, well, that's great, but that's not the mitzvah. That's not the requirement for Pesach, for Passover. The requirement is to tell your own story of your own exodus from your own tight place. Right? It's a gathering of celebration of your own freedoms. And we all go through incredible tight places many times in our life. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which is the same root as tsuris, of trouble. It's the tightness. And sometimes, if you look at Egypt, it was a narrow country because it was focused mostly around the Nile, so that when the Nile flooded, it would irrigate the fields. And they did not have the kind of irrigation that was developed in, say, South America. South America had tremendous irrigation before the conquistadors came. They actually had no hunger. They already had figured out how to at least get potatoes to everybody. So everybody had a staple food, and then you'd supplement it with whatever was around. A lot of fish and a lot of other things. So, back to Pesach. So that's one of the pieces. You can read every single word or none of the words and still satisfy the mitzvah. There's a requirement for 4 cups of juice or wine in the course of the meal, and only a couple of them happen before the meal. 2 are before and 2 are after. And if you come to tonight's Seder, you'll find out that Elijah's cup has a lot more to do with superstition than anything else. It was an even number was actually considered unlucky, and so they added a 5th cup to the tradition. And go ahead and ask your question, Lois. Lois just flagged that she has a question. Go ahead and ask the question about the Seder plate. And then they couldn't remember why they had 5 at a later time, and so it became Elijah's cup because the Talmud only says 4 cups. A lot of 4s in the Seder. A lot of 4s. There's 4 letters in God's name. So that might be a hint. And here's a piece of trivia. Moses is never mentioned in the Haggadah. Not once. There's no mention of him at all. There is a very, very brief mention of the plagues, mostly so that we pour off some of our juice or wine to recognize that freedom had a cost. Right? That freedom is not without a dear price sometimes. And in fact, for Egypt, it was a very dear price.
That was because Moses hadn't come up with his apple tablets yet.
That's right.
Got it.
Yeah, he hadn't come down from the mountain and dropped one of those tablets. Yeah. Ah, yes. We'll never know.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, my husband's comment when he saw that the first time. And interestingly, I was given to watch that movie as part of the homework for my ordination. And the question is, can you use arugula as a bitter herb? Yes. Pickled ginger replace horseradish. The big question is how the ginger was pickled, because you got to be careful with pickling because it's yeasty. It's yeast that causes fermentation. So again, that's part of the clue that yeast it has to be regulated and watched because it's in wine. Yeah. Hello. Beer's not allowed, wine is, and we can get into all the discussions of why.
Well, beer, I understand, the hops.
Yeah. Yeah, and it bubbles and it ferments, and yeah. Some of the Orthodox won't even do matzo balls until the very end because it puffs up in the soup.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah.
it's not yeast, but it puffs up.
Yeah.
And that's just waterlogging. Not waterboarding, but waterlogging.
Yeah, I get that.
And yeah, that's one of the other things I got to do today is finish the soup up. The soup's ready; it just has to be heated. Lots of pre-cooking in this. So those are some of the different pieces. So yes, you can use anything that's bitter. The things that are on the Seder plate, in fact, have changed over time. They are not cast in stone, and what you use is as much a function of where you live and what's traditional. When I was a little girl, the Seder plate typically had 5 things on it. It didn't typically have the romaine lettuce. It typically had the horseradish, a roasted egg, and the egg is never mentioned. It had a shank bone of some sort, which for my mother was usually a chicken neck. We will have a chicken bone on our Seder plate tonight. We'll have a chicken bone that's been singed, a lamb shank. Thank you, Publix, for giving free shank bones out. You just have to ask and tell them it's for Passover, and they graciously give the bones away.
Really?
Yeah.
That's very nice of Publix.
It's a gift of Publix. And then I also have a singed beet to represent the vegan folks, the vegetarians, for whom roasting animals is not an option. And so those 3 things will be there for the shank bone for us. There's supposed to be a spring vegetable. It's typically parsley or cilantro, but it also can be a slice of potato. And
how about squash or something like that? So that's a spring vegetable, right? I think.
It can be squash. Asparagus can be used, broccoli, right? All of those things that are coming up now. So our veggies tonight are going to be Brussels sprouts and broccoli and sweet potatoes and potatoes. So there will not be a lack of food where we are. And we are also supplying, as we always do, because it's Third Friday, we're also supplying the meals for the firefighters. That's just us. Okay, so the Seder plate had, as I said, 5 things. It had the egg, had the shank bone, had the horseradish for the bitter herbs. It had a spring vegetable, and had charoset. Charoset is probably the most interesting substance on the Seder plate. It is a very, very sweet, wonderfully tasty concoction. And the Ashkenaz or European tradition was to take apples, wine, cinnamon, and nuts, walnuts and or almonds, usually walnuts, and mix that together and make it look kind of mortary with a little bit of matzah meal in it to sop up the liquid so that it's goopy, and you put it on the matzah and eat it, and it's very tasty. The Sephardi use figs and dates, so I use them all. I put just about every fruit you can imagine and a couple of different nuts in there. And people like it, so I have a little bit extra. I make a little extra of that. Bill is never reluctant to eat it on matzah, even after Passover. Sometimes I make more of it up later in the year just for him to have to eat. So those were the traditional things. And then over time, we now have a 6th plate and salt water to dip. We now have a 6th one, and it's chazeret, and that is the romaine lettuce, which is the alternative to the horseradish for a really bitter. Because the old traditional Passover meal back in the days of the temple would have been the Pesach, the yearling lamb that's slaughtered, males, and the bitter herb and the matzah, the flatbread. That would have been the meal. Probably wrapped, as I said, matzah probably was much more like a tortilla, and you would wrap the mixture, the bitter herb and the meat. And they wouldn't have eaten tons of meat. They would have eaten about the size of a large olive. That's a serving. If you look at your fist, right, this is a serving of meat. We eat much more than that now. Typically, most people will eat 2 or 3 servings of meat at a meal in America. But that was the traditional Passover meal. And of course, that ended with the destruction of the temple in 67 to 70. Certainly by 70, it was down and burned. And the rabbis then had to look around, and they actually changed the way we celebrate the holiday, which is one of the reasons why, and this is an interesting piece, there is no way that Jesus celebrated a Seder the way we do it today, because it didn't exist.
So the Last Supper is not a Seder.
It's not a Seder. I'm not sure what it was or how it was. And it can't even be by the way that the story is told in Christian scriptures, because in Christian scriptures, the Last Supper is a Thursday. Now, 2 things about Thursday. Passover can never start on a Thursday because you can't go from Passover into Sabbath. So the calendar is rigged that can never happen. And the second thing is that if you're going to have Jesus crucified when the lambs are being slaughtered in the courtyard of the temple, which that's reasonable, it really, kind of hard, never mind. The timing is difficult, but you can't have eaten the lamb the night before and then slaughter it the next day. That's a really strange time travel event, to eat the animal before it's slaughtered. And so since eating the lamb was part of the Passover meal, the Seder meal at the time, there's no way that it could have been. So, I understand that. But the Seder, as we know it today, was a very distinct creation from the rabbis. They talk about it in Talmud. And they looked at the Roman Symposium, and that's reasonable because they were under Roman occupation at the time. They looked at the Zoroastrian or Persian celebration of Nowruz, or spring, which probably included eggs, because there's nowhere in the story of Passover is there anything about eggs. and the jokes about it are not worthy of being on the radio. Let's put it that way.
No Easter bunnies in Passover?
There are no bunnies are not kosher, so they're not going to make their way into Passover.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, they are a fertility symbol, as is the egg. And the egg is probably there as a spring fertility because it's when the chickens start to lay their eggs again. Right? And the bunnies are there.
Springtime.
Right.
Well, now, okay, there was this thing I saw on this one Catholic website that Easter is a pagan holiday. The Easter bunny and all the other stuff, the trappings that went on, and I'm going, oh, please.
Well, there is the holiday of Ostara, which is, there is...
Istara?
Esther.
Esther. Oh, yeah.
Remember her?
Yeah. Party girl.
Yeah, party girl who is named Myrtle, as in of Venus. There's a lot more connection among these things than we like to think of. But the idea of... So pagan is one of those things that I'm going to say gets a bad rap that really isn't deserved. It's a naturalist is right. It's a naturalist religion, and of course it celebrates spring. Of course there's fertility. Of course there's bunnies and eggs as part of the spring rebirth cycle. And you want symbols of fertility because you're planting the seeds for the summer crop. It's a time when you do want fertility, folks, and if people are the least bit superstitious, and people always are, even if we're not supposed to be, and if it doesn't make any sense, because that's post hoc ergo propter hoc is the fallacy of superstition, the wrong thing. We'll get into that another time. And anyway, so there's a good reason for a lot of natural, organic, naturalist kind of traditions eking their way into everything. And then when you add to it a little bit of religious politics, the mix starts to make sense, but it gets really weird at the same time. So yes, the bunnies and the eggs have nothing to do with Jesus, and they are an adaptation of the spring festivals that were in and around spring, and the flowers and the Easter bonnets and all of that. That's about taking off your heavy wool hats, folks, in Europe, which is in the north and cold all winter. So the weather is starting to warm up. And so some of these things aren't going to make sense in the Middle East, where Judaism comes from, because it's a lot warmer. And the agricultural cycle is different in different climates. So yeah, as Europe becomes the center of Christianity, as Constantine and those shortly after him redefine Christianity as the Roman state religion, it does take on changes, and it does incorporate things that are within the Roman Empire and at the fringes of the Roman Empire. That's to be expected. People don't want to give up their stuff when they move and shift. And since Constantine basically, not so much Constantine, but the emperors after him, offered people this wonderful choice of be Christian or die. And that's never good. And what happens when you do that is you get what are called rice Christians, which are people who, they're Christians in name and kinda, but they also bring in their old traditions and they incorporate them. So we see that Christianity is very, very different depending on where you are. And, you know, one of my favorite examples of Christianity and its pieces like that is the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's not the Virgin Mary, although there's an effort to kind of overlap the two. But she actually does come from indigenous religion from the Yucatan.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense because the Virgin of Guadalupe wouldn't be the Virgin of anywhere else. And again, virgin is a wonderful misnomer. It That's not what Jewish scripture says. It says a young woman, a marriageable woman. And, we can have the discussion about whether or not a marriageable woman has to be a virgin. It means something different at the time. There is a wonderful discussion in Talmud about whether or not a priest can marry a pregnant woman. And the discussion goes on to how are the different ways that a woman can become pregnant, because that is somebody who has to marry somebody who's not been with another man. And so how does a woman become pregnant who hasn't been with a man? So it's a wonderful discussion. And they come up with a couple of different ways. And so they say, yes, a priest can marry a pregnant woman who hasn't been with another man. And we'll leave it at your imagination as to where the discussion went. And Talmud's very candid about a lot of things. And it also has to
even back then.
It has
that amazes me.
Yeah, there's one gentleman in the discussion. This is a humorous piece about it, because he says that he can make a woman pregnant without breaking her hymen, which of course is the way that you would tell. And they decide that he's unusual, that he's not typical, and so the example of him can't be used in the general argument. They get down to that kind of nitty-gritty detail. And
is this the Playboy edition of
no, this
Talmud?
is not.
Oh.
Talmud is a very earthy, candid document. For example, one of the things that I like about it is it tells men that if they want to have male children, they should make absolutely sure that the woman climaxes first. Which is an interesting, there's so many questions associated with that comment to think about it and why, and that clearly is a very important issue.
Okay.
Yeah. At least for guys who want male children and for their wives. And women are supposed to be guaranteed their conjugal rights.
There you go.
Especially on Shabbat. So, yeah. Okay. So, back to Pesach. Back to Passover.
Talmud.
It is a very swingy book in places. And, so I've got somebody calling me that I'll have to call back afterward. Okay. Yeah, this has been a day of phone calls, too. Can we still get into the Seder? It's like, yeah, there's a limit to what we can take.
So seriously, so how do you have any spots left at the temple?
We might be able to squeeze one or maybe two in at this point, but not many.
So how many, again, are you expecting?
Around 20.
Okay.
Yeah, and then about another 20 on virtual.
There you go.
So.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. So that can work. And
it seems like part of us we're coming out of that whole
it's a weird kind of it's kind of funny because I'm the president of a service organization down in Stewart, and we had our meeting last night, and there's a certain set of rituals involved in starting the meeting, and I'm like, oh wow, I feel fuzzy about this because it's been so long since we've conducted some of these things. And it is starting. It's slowly starting to come out of it. You see less and less masks. But I still hope that people will wear masks if they have the sniffles or if they don't feel well. We certainly should have learned through this experience that the flu goes down if you wear a mask when you don't feel well.
Or you just stay at home.
What a great idea.
Yeah.
What a great idea. I mean, it's annoying when somebody's not ill and they're supposed to have done something, like teach a class or, be there at a meeting or something like that. Figure a way to make it work and not make people sick. And that's to both sides. The people who are there. It's not worth getting sick over. It's not worth getting sick over. It's not worth getting others sick over. And, so Passover, Pesach, is one of those times when it really is important for people to be ritually pure. Excuse me. My wonderful chronic cough. And so, not where you won't make a bunch of people sick, because you are in community and you've got a lot of traveling germs, if you will, that just come together. And so, So we'll be doing our Seder. Our Seder starts at 6 o'clock tonight. And if all goes well, that means dinner around 7-ish. And it was kind of funny because yesterday Bill was telling me, he says, you need to make sure that your Seder service is short. And I'm like, when is it not? Because the ritual is not to read the book from one cover to the other, but to acknowledge the elements and the milestones and the posts along the way, which we do. We make all of the little stops in the ritual in getting to the meal. But, the idea is not to have people starve before they get there. We also do the Sephardi or Eastern tradition of having food as part of the ritual leading to the meal, which is basically the salad and the appetizers. So, people often complain they're not hungry by the time the meal comes. And that's as it should be, because in the old days you would have eaten the olive size of lamb and be done. So here's another piece of trivia. Most, certainly not European Jews, do not have a lamb dinner for Passover because we no longer have the temple and we're not doing the Pesach, the lambing ritual, the slaughtering of the lambs.
What'd they use?
Normally, just as we are, we're going to have chicken, brisket, and salmon. Duck is popular, too.
Brisket beef?
Yeah.
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 But usually not lamb.
Yeah, it works.
Usually not lamb.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, some Sephardi communities do lamb. And there is the Karaites have permission to the Grizim to slaughter a lamb as part of their ritual. And again, when we say that, it's not a vicious slaughtering. It's supposed to be a painless slaughtering. It's supposed to be painless for the animal. And
did you say Karaites?
Yeah. There's all different kinds of small groups in Israel. And most of the slaughtering is done in prescribed slaughter yards and things like that. But they do it ritually as part of the ongoing process. And, this speaks more to remembering a culture before refrigerators, before motorized wheeled vehicles, when you basically walked your dinner to dinner with you and then slaughtered it and prepared it. And the meal is supposed to be roasted, not broiled. So that's another reason for chicken, salmon.
That could be over several hours back in the day.
Yeah, it probably was. Probably the way it went down was that you would slaughter the animal, you'd cut it up, you'd start roasting it, and then you'd sit around and talk while it cooked. It makes complete sense.
It all makes sense. Oh, yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's when we have today's world with, so I cooked it 3 days ago and it's in the fridge and only needs to be heated, or it doesn't need to be heated depending on what it is. And that luxury wasn't available. And so as people would have been preparing the meal in the moment or waiting for it to cook in the moment, there would have been, what do? You sit and talk.
Or 21st century, you watch Netflix.
There you go.
No,
you can watch the Seder on Zoom.
Well, that too.
And so it's important as we look back at these rituals to recognize where they come from. And so, yes, there are roots. There are older traditions in every festival. And for Easter, it's the bunny and the egg and the bonnets and the flowers. And for, for Jews, we have the eggs. They show up, and they're on every Seder plate. And people kind of like, oh, I guess it's the special offering for the holiday, because you got to come up with an explanation for the whatever's on the plate. The function of the Seder plate, which, by the way, is drawn from the Zoroastrian Nowruz Haft-Sin plat. If you look up Haft-Sin, Haftsin, or Shin, Haft-Sin or Haft-Shin, you're going to find the spring celebration plate and it's going to look an amazing amount like a Seder plate.
Wow.
Yeah.
It goes all the way back to the Zoroastrian.
Of course. Well, because when the rabbis were looking to recreate the Seder after the destruction of the temple, they took the Roman Symposium, because Rome was there. They took the spring festival of Nowruz, and they married them Jewishly. The best way I can describe it. And so they created this Seder that is one of the most enduring and endearing Jewish traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Families will do... They might only come to temple at the high holidays, but they'll still have a Seder of some type. Some kind of a family gathering for Passover. It may or may not look like much of a Seder, but there's something that's going to go on. So it's a very enduring ritual. And ritual is how we pass on our sacred story.
Yeah, and the Jewish families that we knew in L.A. were, the Seder was just amazing.
Yeah. And goes on forever.
It was several hours worth. Yeah.
Yeah, there's the group 613, which is an amazing a cappella group, and you can find their videos on YouTube. They have one called the Passover Sea Shanty, and there's a great line in it, something about just when you think it's over, you find out there's 3 hours more, and
yeah, that's pretty close.
Yeah, there's a long story of the Passover Seder going past midnight, and they often do, and in some way they won't with us because of the logistics and everything, but yeah, if I were doing it at home in absolutely leisure with just some friends, that's what it would go on until it ended. And there's a story in the Seder about the rabbis, and this is one of the wonderful pieces. There's a code embedded in the Seder about Talmud and why Talmudic rabbinic Judaism is the way to the future, and it became that. And that story is wrapped up and tied up inside the story of the rabbis at Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak is an outskirt of Jerusalem / Tel Aviv, that kind of more Jerusalem. Bnei Brak. You can still go there. In fact, I think if you watch Stiesel, which some people in America like to watch, it takes place part of the time in Bnei Brak. And they joke about it. And the story is that the rabbis spent all night discussing the Seder and the freedom from Egypt until their students come in the morning and say, it's time to say the Shema. And that sounds innocuous and it sounds wonderful, and some of my colleagues think they were discussing the rebellion under Bar Kokhba and planning it, which could well be. Who knows? They had to do it sometime. That happens around 130 of the Common Era. So, some number of years into the Seder tradition. But here's the real piece. You have to know, Talmud starts out, the very first discussion in Talmud is, at what time do you say the morning Shema? And the answer is you can say it from the time that you can tell light blue from white and that you can recognize a friend's face. That's part of the discussion. And so...
Sunrise?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Thereabouts.
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah. As dawn is starting to light enough that your eyes are changing mechanisms so that you can see color. Because at night we can't see color. The only time you can see color is if a light's shined on it, so that it activates the color receptors in your eyes.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
And so that's the time at which you can say the morning Shema, the morning prayers. And if you recognize that that's the beginning of the book, at what time do you say the morning prayers? And you end the story of the rabbis at B'nai Brak by saying the students came to them and said, "Rabbis, teachers, it's time to say the morning Shema." And of course, then the first line of Talmud makes, at what time do you say this? And that starts the discussion. So the Seder is the introduction to Talmud, the beginning of Talmud. And Talmud comes from the root limad, to learn, lamad. So it's about learning and teaching. And we say of Talmud, let's learn together. Let's learn some Talmud together. That's how the phrase goes. And so there's a lot of clues and little innuendos in the Haggadah. And you might say, why do they do that? Well, part of it is to make it more interesting and an in-crowd. The other reality is that this is a ritual that grew up under a time of occupation. And so anything that's going to smack of liberation and overthrowing oppression is not going to fly real well, and it's going to have to be hidden. Or the people having the discussion, whether or not they're planning an active rebellion, such as the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which did declare independence for a small number of years until Rome sent about half of its army, between a third and a half of its army, to the little backwater that was Judea, to crush it, to wipe it off the map and rename it Palestina, which is the beginning of Palestine as a name.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's an interesting piece, and that, of course, would have been around 130-something, because they were around for about 4 years until Rome could get enough of the army to crush it. And, of course, with that, a lot of hope stashed.
So going all the way back,
Yeah.
Palestine never really had its own land then,
No.
right?
No, really never did.
They never did.
And,
Wow.
You know, and it's a name that was grabbed from that period because. But yeah, and that's where the argument from some Israelis that it's not legitimate comes from. And the bottom line is, and I'm going to say it doesn't matter. It's like, let's figure out a way to live in peace. I cannot, for the life of me, imagine that God wants us to be at war, to be a lab for all the folks trying to sell armaments and test it in the field. I'm sorry, that's just not my idea of anything good. Except possibly if we want to line their pockets, which is not what I want to give my life for or the life of those I love. So, let this be a time of freedom for all. Because there's another great line in the prophets, which is, as long as somebody is not at peace, there cannot be peace for anyone else. And so until we learn to stop aggressing, and yes, we are going to talk a little bit about Ukraine tonight, because that's tragic what's going on there. It's tragic. And until we have a sea change as a species, and that's what it's going to take, we're not going to have peace, folks. We're just not going to have it. It's an illusion to think you can have it and your neighbor not.
Yeah, I think it was amazing, speaking of Ukraine, that the Ukrainian president, I love him, he called a cabinet, not the cabinet, but the whole Senate and whatever their version of government is, together today. And I thought, wow.
And it's probably not an accident, because tonight is Pesach for them too.
Exactly, yeah, and that's what...
And it's a theme of freedom and hope. Right, that's the other side to that, which is that Passover is about the freedom, the hope of your own homeland. And for the Ukrainians, that's Ukraine. Duh.
You think?
You think, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I can absolutely see them getting really close to this holiday and doing something with it. And for that matter, Easter is a rebirth holiday, right? It's a coming alive kind of thing. So lots of reasons to use this as a rallying, hopeful point. We've got to have hope for the world. And the bad stuff happens, and we haven't figured out how to stop it. But the good news is it doesn't last forever, ever. And, yeah.
But it has lasted our entire lifetimes.
It has, and it was there. There were problems when our grandparents lived and our great-great-grandparents.
Yeah.
And, you know, however many generations you want to go back. We haven't figured out how to live in peace yet. And, you know, that's true whether it's at a family level. Right? There's a Jewish blessing, may you grow to be like Manasseh and Ephraim, who are the two sons of Joseph, born in Egypt. And why are they the source of the blessing? Because they are the only two brothers in all of Scriptures who don't fight. Whoa.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, I like it.
Right? Because arguments and hassles and wars start in families. And, you know, even married couples, there's a power shift going back and forth constantly. And it either is done in love or it's not. And if it's not, then it can get really ugly. And when you add a third or fourth or fifth person to the pack, then the wars become worse. And we've got to figure out how to not solve our problems by punching somebody out, or by being verbally abusive, or being passive aggressive, or any of those things. When we figure that out, when we learn how to satisfy our needs without hurting others, then we're going to begin to come out of Egypt.
How many thousands of years is this going to take?
I don't know. You know, it was kind.
We haven't got it yet.
No, we haven't gotten it. And I have to tell you that we were on the Peace Walk, the Tucson Peace Walk, and a reporter came up to me and she said, "Do I think there was going to be peace in our lifetime?" And I was pretty sure she wanted me to be yes and optimistic and hopeful. And I looked at her and I said, "You know, candidly, I don't think so. I don't see us making the kind of changes that we as a species need to make in order to get along. There does not have to be a have-not for everybody to have. There's enough in the world, folks. There is an abundance of things, and we need to learn how to help people curb